Did you want to record
I
this?
remembered.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Adrian. Well done. So many of you know Kim from her years in Montclair. She has abandoned us and moved to Manhattan for lots of good reason. So I'm so glad to have you back. So I know you as Kim Marcus, but this calls you Kimberly Johnson. So Dr. Johnson, I presume.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Is a professor of social and cultural analysis and affiliate faculty member of the Wagner School of NYU. Her research focuses on American and urban political development, urban and local politics, and race and ethnic politics. You couldn't be more relevant to us now, even though you were before. I'm not going to go through all of this. Kim can tell you she's already written 2 books, Reforming Jim Crow and Governing the American State. Last time Kim came to speak to us, she was joined by 2 people who were on the screen, Carolyn Lack and Rita Singer. And we were talking about the Montclair Public Schools and the court-ordered desegregation of the schools and how, we got to that. I think tonight, Kim is going to take us to that next level. And you can tell us if you finished your book too, because that's what you were working on when, how many was it, 2 years ago when you and Carolyn and Rita did that?
Yeah, I think 2. 2?
So I'm going to stop talking because they'd much rather hear from you. And we're going to mute everybody. Put your questions, as always, into the chat. And I'll try and monitor the chat. And I turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. And I'm really happy to see Rita and Carolyn. My discussion with them at Shomrei actually came at a really good moment in terms of helping me think through my current book project. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kimberly Johnson Marcus. And I study cities, but also at this point, suburbs. And so I just completed a manuscript called Dark Concrete, Black Power and the Black Power Metropolis and American Urban Development. And that manuscript looks at Newark, New Jersey, East Orange, New Jersey, Oakland, California, and East Palo Alto, California. And so I'm really interested in thinking about the sort of emergence and development of what I call Black spaces. So one of the reasons I chose East Orange is because I lived in Montclair. And the other reason I chose Newark is that I lived in Montclair. And there's something to be said about having case sites that are located near your house where you don't have to get into a plane and fly to look at archives. And I think in many ways, my thinking about East Orange, which I think probably many of you think about, has been really shaped by living in Montclair. And I think when I spoke at Shomrei a couple of years ago, really was, well, why does East Orange look the way that it does? And in many ways, East Orange is kind of this kind of shadow hanging over Montclair. No one wants Montclair to become East Orange. And why is that, right? And so in this talk, I'm going to be talking about, well, why does Montclair look the way that it does? And one of the things I think that has really kind of bubbled up to consciousness is the ways in which our geographic space has been heavily shaped by not just market forces, but also by government action, as well as quasi-private action. And so when I spoke at Shomrei a couple years ago, I showed the quote unquote redlining maps. I think lots of people have now seen these redlining maps kind of everywhere. And I think they've really helped people to understand that where different groups live is not by accident. that is very much a consequence of decisions made and not made by government entities, decisions made and not made by private actors like banks and mortgage brokers and real estate brokers, as well as the private actions made by individuals who make decisions or blocked from making decisions about where they live. And then embedded in that is decisions over education. So particularly in the American case, education is completely tightly wound to where one lives. And in fact, one could argue that the your zip code essentially shapes your life chances. And I think especially now in this time of rising inequality, we see this happening across all sorts of different racial and ethnic groups. That is, the poorer you are, the lower your life expectancy. And certainly, if you look at the maps that have been published kind of around March, May, looking at COVID, the impact of COVID in New York City, I showed these two maps in my class, and you look at the map of where people have sent in change of address forms versus where the deaths occurred in New York City. Change of address forms are essentially under 125th Street in Manhattan. Deaths, COVID deaths, are at that point in May were happening in Queens and Brooklyn, where the essential workers were living. So space matters in many, many ways. And so I think when I think about my work, I think about how do we get to a place where space doesn't really matter as much, right? How do we create spaces that create just and equitable lives for everybody, where everyone can not only survive but also thrive? And so that's going to be my discussion today about how do we sort of think about spaces like Montclair, which in many ways I think prides itself on being on the sort of progressive end of the spectrum in terms of having certain kinds of diversity and long-standing diversity and durable diversity. It's not a town in which there's been which has endured white flight. That is a town like East Orange, which went from majority white to majority Black within 10 years. But nor is it a city that has kind of embraced and tried to protect being, say, an all-white enclave, right? And so I think for those of you who live in Montclair, you know that this creates a lot of very interesting politics, particularly around taxes and around schools. And so how do we understand where Montclair is today? I would argue you have to go to the past. So at this point, I'm going to switch to my screen share. I'm an academic, I'm teaching, and boy, oh boy, I am not quite zoomed out, but we're getting close. We're getting close.
Good thing Thanksgiving's coming, Kim.
Yeah, so actually, John, it won't let me share my screen.
Oh, we need to give her rights to share her screen.
Yeah,
Adrian?
So while that's...
All right, I'll get them.
Okay.
John's coming to the rescue. Give me a sec.
Okay. So while John is coming to the rescue, I do want to say, thanks once again to Rita and Carolyn for the materials that they've shared with me and the conversations that we've had. And I also want to say, before I forget, that the Montclair Public Library has been an incredible source of kind of primary material. The Montclair Historical Society has really stepped up and really kind of created a really great lesson plans. And I also want to, I cite her in the screen share, academic Patricia Eget, who has really kind of written, I think, probably one of the most comprehensive histories of Montclair in the last, say, decade or so. So I just want to kind of shout out those resources before, in case I don't have time or I forget. Okay.
You're able to now.
Okay, so we're going to do this now. Hopefully it will work.
Okay.
Are we good?
Yep, there we go.
All right. So I snatched this picture from the announcement, Shomrei announcement, just to give us a little visual continuity. So segregation in Suburbia, what happened and what's happening in Montclair. All right. So as I said before, I mean, usually when we think about segregation, particularly in the last couple of years, it's been structured around this the concept of the redlining map. For those of you who don't know, in the 1930s, in a bid to basically stabilize the housing markets, which had essentially residential housing markets, which had essentially crashed during the Great Depression, the national government stepped in and created the Home Owners Loan Corporation, which was the forerunner of the FHA. And essentially, they wanted to create kind of more standardized mortgage standards. And one of the ways that you do this is by standardizing building techniques and materials, and also standardizing how one appraises property. What makes a property in St. Louis comparable to a property in Newark, or what makes a property in Los Angeles comparable to a property in Atlanta. And that's not only what that property looks like, how it's built, but where it's situated, right? And so we get this redlining map, which essentially, if you see on your right-hand side of the screen, is essentially a grading of space, with A, the green areas being the sort of best areas, and D, the red areas being the worst areas. And that's how we get the notion of red line, literally red line. What does this mean? It essentially means that either in those areas, which are basically shaped by kind of how industrial, how commercial, how old the structures are, and who lives in that area. So if, and for many, many appraisers, and this actually becomes a standard in terms of how they trained appraisers, starting from the, say, 1930s onward, the idea of a negative influence in a neighborhood was part of the way that you appraised a property. And negative influence could be the presence of undesirable establishments and undesirable people, with the most undesirable being African Americans. Second, and then depending on where you were in the country, if you were on the West Coast, it would be Asian Americans. If you were, say, in the upper Midwest, it would include Native Americans. And if you were in the Southwest, it probably would include, at that point, quote unquote, Mexican Americans. So any presence at all of any of these groups in these areas, unless those individuals were servants, was considered an incursion, a negative incursion. And so those areas would be marked as fourth grade, as kind of dangerous areas in which either it was impossible to get an FHA-backed mortgage, or the mortgage that you would get would probably be the equivalent of what we would now call a subprime mortgage. And so from the 1930s onward, you really see the creation of these kind of dual housing markets based on who lives in what space. So if you see my pointer, right about here is Montclair. Yes, here. And what you see is part of Montclair is sort of pink. Part of Montclair is green. Part of Montclair is sort of yellowish, and then it's green. This area right here would be the traditional Fourth Ward. That would be the area kind of across the street from Lackawanna Plaza, and sort of going southward. And that had been sort of, has been the sort of traditional heart of African-American Montclair since the 19th century. So one of the things that I pull out of this map is that many people think, well, segregation happened only because of these maps. And one of the things we have to understand is that this kind of codified, if you will, segregation. It didn't, and certainly extended it, but it didn't create segregation. Again, it sort of codified it and made it and institutionalized it. So when we say something like systemic discrimination, this is what's meant by systemic discrimination. It gets reproduced over and over and over again. So I want us to kind of think about two different kinds of questions. What do we mean when we say segregation? And what do we mean when we say integration, right? That one could actually imagine that segregation means essentially, okay, there's no discrimination based on certain protected classes, race, ethnicity, national origin, creed, at this point, sexuality, disability, etc., right? That you cannot sort of separate people under the sort of cover of law. Well, but what do we mean by integration? Is it enough to simply say, okay, there's no discrimination? What do we mean by sort of bringing different groups together? And I think this is kind of the shoals, if you will, of the kind of 1960s. That is, we have this sort of very triumphant desegregation of the South, and somewhat a desegregation of de facto desegregation in the North. But we really haven't grappled with what does it mean to be integrated? What does it mean to be successfully integrated? What does integration mean? Does integration mean assimilation? Or does integration mean acknowledgement? And I think these are really sort of open questions for us to sort of think about. And I think these two questions, what do we mean by segregation and what do we mean by integration, kind of, again, are sort of in the backdrop of how Montclair sort of grapples with issues around race and ethnicity during the 20th century. But it grappled with issues about race and ethnicity even before the 20th century. So this is the freed slave house. I actually was astonished when I moved to Montclair that this cute little house was actually the slave house. And then later found out that it actually had a name, the James Howe House. And I think about 5 or 6 years ago, it had a very bad fire. I'm not sure where it stands in terms of its sort of rehabilitation. And this is just, on your right-hand side, a quote from someone talking about James Howe, the enslaved person who lived in this house during the 19th century. And it's, again, this language is somewhat problematic by modern standards, but I just want to sort of say and acknowledge that African Americans have been in New Jersey since colonial days and have played a part in sort of shaping how the state dealt with race, and certainly how places like Montclair dealt with race. And so ideas about race, about separation, about inclusion have always been part of the sort of Montclair identity and part of the Montclair sort of politics, if you will. So Montclair then, from the 19th century, has always had a kind of small African-American community. Many of them were domestic servants of more well-to-do people who lived in Montclair, and increasingly by the early 20th century, Montclair became known as one of the few kind of open places that if you were a middle-class African-American, a professional person, you could actually live in the suburbs. You weren't stuck living in New York City or Newark. You could actually have a pretty nice house in the suburb. And so that creates kind of an interesting Montclair, in which it is a Montclair in which the African Americans who live there really span a kind of a broad diversity of economic classes, from, again, well-to-do professionals to working class folks as well. So it's a very, it's small, but it's a fairly, it's a very robust and very organized community. Many of the families who lived in Montclair in the early 20th century still live in Montclair. And I think that's kind of, again, an interesting dynamic because in some ways they know where the bodies are buried, right? And so that kind of creates a certain kind of politics, so that if one is having a debate about schools and inequality or inequity within the school system, there are people who can say, well, listen, my grandparents were here and this is what we were having a huge struggle about. And so I think, again, one of the things to think about Montclair's kind of racial politics is that African Americans have been in Montclair for quite a while. And so I think maybe letting go of the idea that African Americans are sort of sojourners, that they sort of come and they're going and that they don't have sort of long-term stakes in the community. I just want to say that to your left, this is Charles Bullock. He is actually the person for whom the school, the newest Montclair school, and although not so new, is named for. He actually was instrumental in setting up a colored YMCA, so a segregated YMCA. The Montclair YMCA was one of two suburban YMCAs that were built at that moment. The other one was in Evanston, Illinois, and I think it really sort of displays kind of the amount of kind of social clout that Montclair Black leadership had at that moment, very connected in some ways. So that's kind of the respectable side, if you will, of Montclair. But Montclair was made up of different groups. So in addition to whites, in addition to blacks, oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. And Montclair actually kind of plays little interesting roles in African-American history. Booker T. Washington actually did a sort of publicity / fundraising tour a year or so before his death. And one of the places that he stops in is actually in Montclair at this is the original building of the colored YMCA. And that's Booker T. Washington, if you were curious about what he looked like. But in addition to African Americans, the town also had a very solid Italian American population as well, largely around the sort of Pine Street area, but then also going down further into the Fourth Ward. And this is and I'm blanking on names because I always do this when I do a presentation. The church on Pine Street, St. Sebastian?
Mount Carmel.
Mount Carmel. Whew, thank you, Mount Carmel. I'm going to write this down right now. Mount Carmel.
That was Carmel.
And I think one of the interesting things about this moment and about anxieties around race is the very interesting position that Italian Americans kind of hold during the sort of 20th century. And I think when I last presented at Shomrei, people were sort of surprised that there was this depth of bias towards Italian Americans. And so when we go back and we look, say, for example, at the redlining maps and the accompanying documentation of those maps, not only do we see this area is a declining area, quote unquote, because of the presence of African Americans, we also see that this area is a declining area because of the presence of Italian Americans. And for some parts of New Jersey, for example, Maplewood, that is actually seen as a space that is sort of in danger of further incursion from Jews. And so it's it's a remarkable document, I think, because discrimination around race and ethnicity and religion is really just out there. I mean, there's no civil rights laws that say one shouldn't do this. I mean, it really is just very explicit. So in addition to African Americans, in addition to Italian Americans, this is a more recent shot of Pine Street. It's just a shadow of itself, and you can see that actually to the left would be this sort of new transit-oriented development that's occurred that really has kind of disappeared that traditional neighborhood. One of the ways to think about segregation in Montclair during the 20th century, and I would argue even until today, is to think about its religious institutions. So these are 3 Catholic churches in Montclair. This is Mount Carmel, that's the sign. And this is St. Peter Claver, and this is Immaculate Conception on Valley Road. Why show these 3? Because under sort of the then institutional practices of the Catholic Church, this was considered kind of a real church, and these were considered quote unquote missions. They didn't quite have the same status as a real church. And the reason it was done is because it was felt that African Americans and Italian Americans didn't really belong, if you will, to sort of more mainstream congregations. And so when we talk about segregation, when we talk about separation, it's not just housing, it's not just schools. It really is kind of woven into the day-to-day lives of people who lived in Montclair.
So Kim, before
Yes.
you go
Sure.
on, I'm not sure everybody could see the arrow, but
Oh,
St. Cassian's, I think you were saying, is the Upper Montclair. That
no,
was,
this is the one, Immaculate Conception
oh, okay.
on Valley Road.
North Fullerton.
North
North
Fullerton.
Fullerton.
The big
So
one on North Fullerton.
I know, and I've like, how many times have I gone down that road?
That's why I was wondering.
Yeah,
North
sorry about
Fullerton
that.
is the big one. Yeah.
Right. But these are, again, 3 different churches that were literally designed and meant to serve 3 different populations, with the assumption that these populations should be kept separate.
But can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I mean, that's just, I mean, it was like an ethnic thing. I know, I grew up in Jersey City.
Mhm.
You had the Polish church, you had the
Right.
Irish church, you had the Ukrainian church. It was just people wanted to be with their own tribe, and they built their own tribe, their own churches. And
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think yes and no, in the sense that certainly churches were built by, quote unquote, their own tribe. I think you're completely right on that. But I think if you look at the way in which church funding actually occurred, the funding was based on kind of what group that church served. And certainly for St. Peter Claver, which is below Bloomfield Avenue, it was definitely a segregated church. And so, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's getting into sort of Catholic Church kind of history, which I'm really not in any way beginning to even understand. But I just want to sort of emphasize that there are these sort of divisions that are kind of embedded in our landscape and in our day-to-day lives. And so that, I think, is something, again, as we think about sort of who is kind of doing what in Montclair, we're together, yet we're also separate, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yep.
Okay, so, and here's where it's separate. And so I should say that, again, some of these images and sources I've gotten from the Montclair History Society, and they've just really done a great job of kind of gathering kind of really local history. And this on your right-hand side is a picture of the Klan, just kind of marching around, doing their clanny stuff. And on the left-hand side is this very interesting article about interracial couple in Montclair. And that's an interesting, I think, kind of little weird microhistory of Montclair, is that it kind of becomes known as the place where interracial couples can kind of live in somewhat peaceful situations. And so that, again, I think is kind of an interesting history, and I think shapes kind of this kind of interesting ongoing dynamics around race in Montclair. This is another example closer to home, and this is like, yay, Shomrei. And I think probably older members might know more about this incident than I do. But there was actually a Jewish Negro family that belonged to Shomrei in the early 1960s. And the story that I've heard, and certainly in this article, is that they went to one of these beach clubs, which was very curious to me as someone who grew up mostly in California, that a beach club in New Jersey was actually a pool surrounded by a parking lot, but that's just me. And so they go to this sort of beach club and they see 2 or 3 African-American kids in the bus, and they say, we're not letting you in, we'll let everyone else in, but we won't let the kids in. And the Shomrei bus basically said, we're out of here. And they left and turned around, and good for Shomrei. But again, I think, we think about these things as being sort of very far back in time. But I think, again, thinking about what are the sort of long-term consequences of this. So on your left-hand side, this is a famous episode where there was a jump in where African-American youth and allies jumped into a pool to desegregate the pool. So one of the things about when we talk about integration, it very much comes up against this kind of uncomfortableness with socializing amongst different racial and ethnic lines, and ideas about intimacy. And so one of the things that happens as desegregation of public spaces proceeds in places where where a particular line of intimacy has been crossed, a lot of pools, especially pools that were in danger of being integrated, were actually closed down. And so when you look at statistics about the number of, say, African Americans who don't know how to swim, part of that legacy of the lack of ability to swim is actually linked to decisions made in the 1960s to essentially shut down pools where there was a possibility of racial integration in these spaces. So again, we think about these things as kind of far away, but I just want to sort of introduce the idea that they have these kind of long-term consequences that we're still seeing today. So again, thinking about the sort of higher risk that African-American kids have in terms of drowning, and part of it is really related to not having access to resources like pools because of this backlash and real fear of racial mixing. All right. So in addition to African Americans, Italian Americans, we have another group, Jewish Americans. And one of the things that starts to happen in the 1950s is the suburbanization of Jews, along with the suburbanization of other groups. So on your right-hand side is a map of nationalities in Newark, and you see that there is this very large Jewish neighborhood that eventually moves kind of more to the west and to the south, and that, if we're looking at the arrow, that becomes kind of Philip Roth's Newark, right? All the books that he writes about Newark, this is where they come from, and this is where they go, to Irvington, to Maplewood, to South Orange, to West Orange. And certainly if we're thinking about Italian Americans move out of Newark, which actually had the 4th largest Little Italy on the East Coast. And they move to certainly Belleville and Nutley, but they sort of jump over to West Orange and beyond. So Chris Christie, if you remember, our former governor, his family actually moved from the North Ward of Newark out to West Orange, basically in the aftermath of the Newark rebellions in 1967. And so even as Montclair is grappling with segregation, desegregation, integration, Essex County, in which it's embedded, is undergoing its own kind of changes, right? It's massive, quote unquote, white flight from Newark, but certainly as Newark faces its own challenges, again, post 1967, you get the movement of middle class and working class Blacks out of Newark to places like East Orange, West Orange, and to Montclair. And so we like to think that, Newark kind of is far away from us, but I think especially post 1967, anxieties about what was happening in Newark, what seemed to be happening in East Orange in terms of racial change, certainly was a deep matter of concern to folks living in Montclair. Would Montclair go the same way as East Orange? Would it become a majority African-American suburb? And what would that mean? And so I think that, again, there are other folks who are at Shomrei who, like Carolyn and Rita, really kind of worked really hard, I think, to figure out how do we make Montclair a place that is racially and ethnically stable, right? How do we sort of stave off white flight? How do we sort of ensure that property values remain stable, and not and not by pushing the unwanted populations, i.e. African Americans, out. And I think this is, again, I think a real struggle that Montclair has been working around for decades, certainly since the 1960s. So going back to housing, one of the issues that I think, again, is sort of perennially faces Montclair is that even though it is diverse, it is not necessarily integrated at the neighborhood level. That is, there are large parts of the town that are primarily dominated by one group or another. And so again, while we might be a diverse town, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're integrated at kind of literally the neighborhood level. And part of it, again, is historic, right? So I'm pretty sure, and I've told a number of people of this, when we moved to Montclair, we were the second owners of our house. The people who owned our house actually had a big plaque proclaiming their membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution. And we also got a very, very nice Christmas card from George and Laura Bush, which our oldest son, who was 4 at the moment, was like incredibly proud of, and put it up on his bulletin board, like, I got a Christmas card from President Bush. And we were like, yay. So, it really was a very, I think, racially and ethnically and politically divided community. And I think those kinds of divisions, again, sort of still stick with us. But anyway, back to the story of my house, I'm pretty sure, I didn't look all that hard, but I'm pretty sure that my house had something called a racial covenant attached to it. So basically, a racial covenant was something inserted into the deed of the house, essentially saying that you couldn't sell the house to certain groups. In the 1940s, this becomes unconstitutional in the sense that the court says we're not going to enforce it. But in a sort of, on one hand, not really listening to the other hand, the FHA essentially told property developers and mortgage brokers, well, we're not going to issue a mortgage unless there's actually a racial covenant in the deed. So even though on the one hand, the court's saying, no, not really legal. On the other hand, in practice, these are still very much live documents. In Montclair, though, it gets a little tricky because of its kind of history of 20th century history of openness. There are some groups who are increasingly not getting those kinds of discriminatory tactics used against them. But for African Americans, it's still very much a housing market that is difficult to enter into if one wants to enter into a all-white or majority white neighborhood. So Blacks can move to Montclair, but they're very, very much limited into what kinds of neighborhoods that they could move into. And I think that it wasn't really until I think the 1980s and 1990s that we start seeing parts of Montclair becoming kind of racially diverse for the first time ever. So this leads us to education. And I think, again, this is a place where I think Rita and Carolyn have done just amazing, amazing work. So like many schools in the North, Montclair schools were integrated, but not really. They were what we would call de facto segregated. So it meant that segregation was not created by law, i.e. like in the South where it literally said whites can't go to school with Blacks. It was created through administrative mechanisms, the drawing of district or attendance lines. It was created through different types of curriculum being offered to different types of schools and the tracking or pushing of different groups to different schools. And so what we had in Montclair was essentially a segregated school system with a little bit of integration at the high school level and in some of the schools. So This is a chart, and again, this is all stuff from the Montclair Historical Society. This is a chart of 1947, the racial makeup of Montclair elementary middle schools, and what you see is that Bradford, Edgemont, Hillside, Mount Hebron. I'm not sure what George Washington is. I think that might be the one that's on North Fullerton or on Valley Road.
South Mountain. It's the one that the special ed schools there now.
Right. Okay. Right. Across
Okay.
from the bakery.
No, South Mountain. Do you know
South
where
Mountain.
Judy Wildman used to live? Down there.
Oh, okay. Okay. So if you sort of note though, and if you kind of have your mental map of Montclair with you, basically these are mostly schools that are located either in the northern part of town or actually in South Mountain. Grove Street, I think, is now at the special ed school, right?
Yes.
Right.
So,
And then right.
yes.
And then right, and then Northeast literally is Northeast. So by contrast, Glenfield, which is right, like literally right below Bloomfield Avenue, Rand Street, I'm sorry, which is right next to the high school, and Glenfield Middle have the lowest percentage of schools, of whites. What does this mean? What this means is that essentially Montclair essentially said that we mostly are going to make Blacks and Italian Americans go to 2 or 3 schools. The kicker becomes it's not only forcing them or encouraging them or channeling them to certain schools, it's also what's offered at the schools. So for decades and decades, if you were sent to or forced to Glenfield Middle School, they simply did not have pre-college prep courses. So for example, if you have kids in the Montclair school system, there's this whole thing about placement, middle school math placement, right? That you have to take a certain sequence of classes in order to get into a certain math class by freshman year in order to take AP, whatever, senior year high school so that you can be competitive for a good college, right? I think a number of us have gone through that. Well, imagine if you go to a school which literally does not offer these pre-prep college prep classes. And so you go to the school and you go to Montclair High School and you say, well, I'd like to take college prep classes. And they say, oh, well, you didn't take the pre-college prep classes. Sorry. And so there's a certain kind of inequality that's literally administratively put into place, in which the schools are integrated, right? They're not segregated, but the schools certainly aren't equal. And so what happens, African American parents and students essentially say, well, that's not acceptable, particularly in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education. How can it be that we're going to schools that are separate and unequal? That's just not, that can't be. And so this leads to a legal case against the school system, which I believe was settled or first ruled in 1968. And that becomes the beginning of a really torturous process to essentially integrate Montclair schools. I think and folks can jump in, certainly Shirley can jump in because I think you're probably more of an expert than I am. So different types of schemes to kind of get different population groups together in the schools. And I think that it has had mixed success. I think that there are still some schools that tend to have more of one group or another. Is that preference? Is it sort of self-selection, or is it something else? I think is very much under debate. But I think what's happening, at least as an experience as a parent, someone who had kids in the Montclair school system, is that when we get to the middle school and high school level, these are integrated schools, but they are actually separated in terms of tracking. And I think when we think about things like the achievement gap, that this is where we see the kind of limitations of our imaginations around what do we mean by segregation and what do we mean by integration. Because certainly I think at the high school level, the kids are in the same building, but they're not in the same classes. And I think that is increasingly problematic.
It is,
What's
I
that?
can say it is being addressed, I think, more directly now, even than when I was on the board. So Kim, before you go on, there were just a couple of comments that might be interesting. One is from Roosevelt, who was Roosevelt Neesmith, who's the president of the Board of Home Corps,
Okay.
who spoke a couple of weeks ago, said there is a racial covenant against sale to Negroes in my deed. It wasn't enforced in 1991. I'm assuming that's when Roosevelt bought the house. So I think that's what he, Rita was talking about the George Washington School was on Baldwin Street, opposite Nicolo's. And that was the school for kids with special needs is what I think it was at the time.
Okay.
So let me let you go on. And I have one other question that popped up. And the question then is, why did East Orange end up the way it did and Montclair didn't?
Okay. I think two things happen, and this slide is actually one of the things that happens. What happens in, okay, so this is, if you look on your right-hand side, that is Interstate 280. And Interstate 280, essentially, it opens up kind of West Orange, the kind of Western Essex County suburbs. And there have to be decisions about where to place that highway. Basically, the highway 280 is essentially put through African-American neighborhoods in Newark, East Orange, and Orange. So this is a map of the actually colored YMCA in Orange. And this is the train line. So this is Highway 280. So what happens in East Orange is essentially East Orange is divided in half by 280, and then divided kind of in quarters, and then divided first divided this way by the Parkway, and then divided in half by, I'm trying to get my camera angle right, by 280. And so actually in The Human Stain by Philip Roth, he has this really great extended kind of meditation of someone who, had one of the characters who'd kind of grown up and lived in East Orange, and talks about the way in which urban renewal essentially pulls out the heart of East Orange, and that the kind of shopping areas and the kind of upper middle class suburbs, the suburban housing neighborhoods really just kind of collapse because of the highway. And so what happens in East Orange is that because essentially when you put a highway through neighborhoods, it surprisingly is not good for adjacent neighborhoods. And one of the interesting things is the furious lobbying of Montclair to ensure that that highway stays south of Montclair. And so East Orange basically loses that. And so essentially you have this whole swath of housing and neighborhoods that are adjacent to this highway that just collapses, the housing values collapse. When the housing values collapse, they essentially are turned into rental housing. And then people who are leaving Newark because of the increasingly bad housing conditions in Newark, essentially move into East Orange. One of the interesting things about East Orange is they is they have a planning director, Scott Bagby, who really is focused on trying to essentially erase through urban renewal African-American neighborhoods, whether they're poor neighborhoods or middle-class neighborhoods. He actually gets hired by Montclair in the 1950s. And he actually tries essentially to do the same thing, like, oh, you know, it's this neighborhood, it's full of African-Americans, we should erase it because it's a blight. And the African-Americans who live in the neighborhood are like, well, we all own our houses. It's not blighted. It looks exactly like houses 3 blocks away. Why are you focusing on us? And so I think that there are ways in which Montclair could have gone the way of East Orange in terms of aggressively kind of engaging in urban renewal and kind of erasing African-American neighborhoods. But I think what's also interesting, and this is something that Patricia Eget gets into her work, the ways in which the sort of African-American community, because it was so long-standing, because they had so much kind of political and social capital, joined with groups like the League of Women Voters to really say, no, 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 we're not going to be pushed out of our neighborhoods. And we're going to insist on the city actually, you know, investing in, continuing to invest in our neighborhoods. And so I think that's probably one of the big differences between East Orange and Orange. I'm sorry, East Orange and Montclair is that I think that they were able to create coalitions to really push back on the rhetoric of either getting rid of African-American neighborhoods or disinvesting in African-American neighborhoods, and also for pushing for effective removal of de facto segregation, which East Orange never really dealt with. And so basically middle-class whites essentially started leaving the East Orange school system by the sort of mid-1960s, even before the town had sort of, even while the town was still majority white.
Wow.
So Montclair was really good about kind of making sure that there was stable sort of integrated schools of some kind in its town, as opposed to East Orange, which really didn't quite grapple with the issues of how do you sort of maintain stable integrated schools. And then I think one more, because I can talk a lot, I know that, I always have to stop myself. One more, which is, you know, just thinking about how do we commemorate past and future. So this is that famous picture of Israel Crane House being moved to its new location. But then also it's the belated acknowledgement that in fact it was the home of the colored YWCA. And so again, thinking about how people kind of organize themselves and create communities of inclusion in suburban spaces. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay.
All right.
And you get to take a breath.
Okay.
We only have a few minutes.
I'm so sorry. I tend to overtalk. I really do.
But I think the comments are that this is a history that I don't think we all knew or understood. So we have time for a few questions. If there are some, I think the last comment was from Lisa saying, you know, this was so interesting. And, you know, it's a piece that we don't know about and we don't pay attention to. Makes me feel better about Montclair that at least it fought to maintain a certain character. And although there's a lot to be done. And of course, the Bullock School was placed where the colored Y was, the little Y it was called. And so it made sense to give it the Bullock name.
Right. Absolutely.
So David Grill says, how do we get this history to all the newcomers moving into town?
Ooh, you know, it's interesting. I think like this discussion has to take place at least every decade, it seems. Mm-hmm. And I remember when we first moved to Montclair, and I think a couple of years later, there was, you know, a recession, and people say, oh, you know, let's get rid of the school buses. You know, that'll save money, which according to Shirley, it doesn't really save all that much money. Right. But having to have this process of kind of educating new folks to say, well, it's not just that I think maybe it was either Carolyn or Rita who said it's the school system it's about what's at the schools, right?
Right.
And that is what makes Montclair a unique place, is that having integrated schools is a commitment, and that you have to constantly work at it. Like all good things, just once you put into place it, as we now know, institutions and norms are not self-sustaining. One has to kind of revitalize them. And so I know that at one point there was kind of wording and links on the Montclair website, but I think that's kind of a passive way of communicating that to people. I don't know. I mean, I think that maybe it's something that happens at the very first PTA meeting.
So there a couple of things. Some people are posting. Rita posted a site, a historical site that you can get some of this information.
Mm-hmm.
The schools actually did a wonderful, when I was on the board, so this is really a long time ago, the history of how the schools came to be the way they are, the whole story of the DSEG. I don't know if they still use it now. And I think the telling the story of Montclair becomes more and more important in the face of the fact that Montclair is going to become unaffordable just about for everyone.
Yeah.
And so it really is a challenge. I don't think we're going to solve it tonight because we are at time. Kim, I can't thank you enough, but I do have a secret for you.
Okay.
For the At Nourish folks, Kim's other half, Dan, there he is.
Wave hello, Dan. Wave hello.
Say hello, Dan. Dan is actually going to be speaking in 2 weeks because Dan did something with his life that I found so interesting that I said he should tell everybody about it. He left corporate America, actually corporate England, because he was with Barclay, which is an English company, and decided to take a look at his life, travel, and do, did we say tikkun olam? Is that what we called it, Dan? And
yes, tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam. And so Dan left his job at the bank and went to Africa to do a special project for 6 months. I think you get credit for putting up with that, Kim, too.
It's okay.
It's okay. And so I think that Dan will be back with us, and join Dan to hear that story. And Kim, I'm sure, will be here. So if you have anything to ask her then, she will, I'm sure, be available. And with that, there are so many comments, I have lost track. But I think the last issue that's being talked about here is the issue of affordability. And that's my husband David's pitch for Home Corps, because that is one of the small agencies trying to keep affordable housing available in Montclair.
I'll just say one quick thing, which is that people have to sort of be okay with difference. I think that there is a assumption that affordable housing means, guns and drugs and whatever. I don't know what it is. And I think that people have to sort of just recognize that affordable housing just means housing that is affordable to people who, can't afford to live in Montclair. And that's a lot of people.
Right.
And not let it be stigmatized.
Right. And we've got to make it available. And we need to keep people who earn low incomes, who are our frontline workers. We need to keep them here. And so everybody's saying thank you. And so with that, I want to say thank you to Kim. I really appreciate you putting another hour on Zoom and taking us through this. So thank you. It
was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. We miss you. So when all of this is over, you guys will have to come back to Montclair, and we'll have a little party for you and Dan. So,
okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay well. Have a good holidays. Be safe.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.